Hello and welcome to yet another video. I'm Bolboaca. I'm coming to you from the Mozaic Works studios, and today I am alone. This will be a solo video, but I'm also managing the broadcast, so I hope everything will be working fine. Let's just quickly check the sound levels. Yeah, looks fine. All right, please let me know if anything is not working properly, since again I am alone. So today what I like to talk about is about Scrum, Kanban and extreme programming, and it all started from a series of tweets by Sergio Pereira. He is 3-time startup founder, 5-time CTO, remote work lover, public speaker. He tweets about startups, techs, and remote work, and he has a product plug there as well. And this series of tweets I found very interesting because it's something that I've often seen related to Scrum and XP, Scrum and Kanban. And what I find interesting is that he created his own method, which is a good thing, right? We don't necessarily need to work in a Scrum way. And what is interesting is that this method actually, to me, looks very similar with ideas from extreme programming. And so what I like to do is to react to this series of tweets and to also talk about the differences and the different focuses of Scrum, Kanban and XP, and where I think is their value. And I'd like of course, if possible, to have a conversation. So if you have any questions, any comments, I'm monitoring them. Again, I'm alone, so I'll be looking at screens from time to time. I hope you understand. And I'll be trying to answer questions if you have any. All right, but before we jump into this, so this is where we started from, and this is the process that Sergio describes, the process that he arrived at. And I'm going to come back to this, but I think it's important just quickly to go and recap a bit what are the most important parts of Scrum, Kanban and XP. So let's look a bit down here. Okay, let's close this. And can I make this? Okay. This is the Scrum process as described by Scrum org. You have a product backlog, you have a sprint planning. In the sprint planning, the Scrum team decides on a sprint backlog, and then you do daily Scrum, and after, let's say, 10 cycles of this, usually sprints are around 2 weeks, you can have shorter sprints, you can also have larger sprints. You have a potentially shippable increment for your product. You do a sprint review and a sprint retrospective. So in the sprint review, you review what you delivered, and in the retrospective, you think about how to improve. And this is what Scrum, what we usually know, we usually talk when we talk about Scrum. And I'm phrasing it like this because there are a few important things that I feel are often missed. Scrum is about empirical process control, and every word matters here. An empirical process, what does empirical means? It means that you learn from experience, from experiments. Process control is about, so you have a process, but you also want to control it. You want to control the results. You want to improve in time. And so this is the key phrase for Scrum. And another important thing that I found in some talks, I think it was a talk by Jeff Sutherland at Google. He said that Scrum is a bootstrapping process, so fundamentally you are not supposed to do this process as it is here. This is a way of starting that allows you to get to the point where you can actually have a process that is adapted to your needs. So if you keep doing precisely, this is fundamentally a skeleton that you use. And then you start from a few guidelines, but then you can adapt your process to whatever you need. So this is what is Scrum. Okay, let's look at extreme programming. Extreme programming was considered back in around the same time when Scrum appeared. Actually, I think it was before Scrum. It was considered like a magic trick to speed up your development and to make things work better. And the way extreme programming is described is through these practices. You have a set of practices related to, let's say, how you develop the code, test-driven development, pair programming, simple design, refactoring. These have fast feedback. You then have another set of practices: collective ownership, coding standards, sustainable pace, metaphor, and continuous integration. Now you may recognize some of those because we are using them, or at least they should be used in any Scrum implementation. Collective ownership: the code is not owned by a person. It's not like there used to be this thing that the programmer who wrote the code was also maintaining it and so on. In these types of organization, the code is owned by a team, by the group, there's a collective ownership. Coding standards, many companies have them. Sustainable pace: you shouldn't work for a long time after hours or extra time and do crunch time. This is another practice that I think now it's fairly common, except perhaps some industries like gaming. And gaming is still, it doesn't happen yet. Continuous integration: I think everybody's using it now, or mostly everybody. Although it's worth saying that it's a practice, it's not a server, it's not a tool. It's the practice of continuously integrating your code with everybody else's code. This is what continuous integration is. And then system metaphor: this is one practice that didn't quite catch because it's very difficult to do. This was, the idea was to find a metaphor for your architecture or for your design so that it's easier to understand it by comparing it to somebody else. So for example, you could have a metaphor for production in which you have like stages in your design, and you have an input and it goes through stages and it ends in an output, and that would be, let's say, a production line metaphor. But it's quite difficult to find these metaphors, so I haven't seen them a lot. And then you have another set of practices whole team. So the whole team is working together. It's, again, something that's very similar with Scrum. Customer tests, something you would probably call today acceptance test driven development, where you write some acceptance tests in collaboration with the customer. For example, using nowadays, maybe you'd use something like behavior driven development to write those. Small releases, again, something that's common. And a planning game, which was, so planning poker, if you ever used it, it has its roots here. And so the key phrase here, at least what I've heard from experienced XP professionals, is that you deliver value under extreme uncertainty. This is why XP is very fit for things like startups, where you don't precisely know what you want to, at least in the discovery phase. When you don't know exactly what you will deliver, you are just trying to find a product market fit. And I know this may sound a bit weird for many programmers, but the truth is that you often don't know, right, what you will deliver. You might hide it under the pretense of having an idea for a product that's quite detailed, but the reality is that the market will push you. So you will either fail, or the market will push you towards a niche where you can deliver a product that actually is useful for a certain market. And then another thing that was very important here is that engineering practices enable change. So you have things like test-driven development, pair programming, refactoring, simple design, plus continuous integration, coding standards. All these are part of extreme programming. And these are practices that enable change. They allow you to move faster and not slower, as you might think if you are not experienced with these practices. And so extreme programming is this very interesting thing that mixes organizational and technical practices into one thing that works. And because of this, it's a very powerful technique. It helps you a lot. It can help speed up development. Now, the thing here is one important difference between Scrum and XP is in Scrum you have those sprints that are fixed length. Let's say 2 weeks. It can be 1 week. It can be 3 days. It can be 3 weeks, although I don't recommend that. But it is a fixed length, a fixed duration. In XP, what you do is you figure out what is the goal, the next business goal, and then you have an iteration. And the iteration is about developing that goal, but you also revisit the existing code through these practices, test-driven development, refactoring, simple design. So this means that you will have iterations that are of different durations. So you don't necessarily have the same duration for XP. You can, but it's not necessarily to have the same duration. Now, let's go to the next one, which is Kanban. And here what you have is a Kanban board that shows how complex it can be. I think many people, when they think about Kanban, they think about the board and about moving stickies on the board. But Kanban is not about that. The reason why this is such a complex, and I've seen actually much more complex boards, is because you need to make everything visible from the moment you receive a certain request until the moment you deliver. You have the whole process visible and the whole status visible. And so this is very interesting. It allows you to visualize everything. And then the next thing you have is, which is not visible here, and it should be, minimize work in progress. You can do this in a number of ways. You can minimize the items you have in a column, minimize the items that a person can take, minimize the items per swim lane. You can also have swim lanes, which are kind of horizontal lines here that represent different types of work and that split your capacity. So for example, if you have a team that is doing development and bug fixes and dealing with production incidents and also researching some new ways of some new tools or some new architecture, you'd have a swim lane for all of these. And for each of these, and for each swim lane, you can have some allocated capacity, and the process can be different based on the swim lane. So if you have an incident, most likely you'll have a fast track process that allows you to move the task into done as soon as possible, to fix the production incident as soon as possible. The key phrase here is to minimize waste, and you do that by very carefully looking at the status of your board, because the board is telling you a lot of things. So for example, here I can see, even though I'm not sure exactly if there's some color coding, but I would imagine there is some color coding, so we can see these types of items. There are more of those here, and the question is why. And then I can see that we have a number of things that are done. Very few of them are of this color. So this means that maybe there is a blockage here, so it might be interesting to look at it. I have too many things. Well, I have a lot of things in the possible category, which is okay because possible is like a bucket that we use. But then, so maybe here I have a lot of ideas. Okay. But in doing, I still have like a lot of things. Depends also on the size of the team. We tend to start from about 2 items per person. Just a rough rule of thumb, but you adjust them. You adjust the work in progress limit depending on your context, right? So there's just a rule of thumb. You can start with whatever you want. Some teams work only with 1 item. So we see a lot of blue things in here in doing, and the question is, why aren't they done? Of course, it matters a lot on what type of work this is. Anyway, so the board, the key thing is the board can tell you a lot of things. You want to minimize waste. One type of waste is, for example, if you wait here between columns. So that's why the very important thing and the key, let's say, about Kanban is stop starting, start finishing. We don't want to start things. We really, really want to finish things. And we don't want to start a lot of things, but we want to finish as fast as possible. And the good thing about Kanban is that you can start wherever you are as an organization, and then you aggressively reduce waste. And by doing so, you introduce, probably if you're doing software development, because Kanban, like Scrum, apply to all types of work. But we are talking about software development here. If you're doing software development, you'll probably end up with something resembling XP. This is why Kanban with XP work extremely well together. This is something that I've noticed, and I would really encourage you, if you have the possibility to work with the XP techniques and to learn the XP techniques, you can very easily mix and match Kanban with XP. Because basically what you do is you build this board, you have a goal, you have the tasks, you have all your process. Most of it becomes automated through continuous integration, and here we also need to add continuous delivery, actually, with DevOps and all these things that didn't exist when extreme programming appeared. All right. So these two are really good together. You can also mix and match Scrum with Kanban. There's something called Scrumban, where you have this process, but instead of having the normal simple Scrum board of to-do, doing, done, you have the full Kanban board with everything, the whole process visible. But these are all variations on the same idea. If you want to learn more about extreme programming, there are many resources. That here, Ron Jeffries' article, What is Extreme Programming, gives you the fundamentals. There are some books by his name escapes me today. The person who actually rediscovered discovered extreme programming. It will come to me. Anyway, so let's go back. What is the relation between these and what Sergio was saying here? Well, I'm gonna look quickly at his process. So basically he ended up with this. Why? Describe the business problem opportunity we are addressing by working on this feature. What impact do we expect that makes this effort worth it? And this is what we would define as a goal for an iteration in extreme programming. Then describe the scope of work for this feature. What are specific action items we need to do in order to solve the problem opportunity we pinpointed in the why? Well, scope of work. So you need to do some kind of planning, right? And if you look at XP, you have the plan, the planning game, or right? How? Describe the technical solution required to deliver the what. Outline different viable approaches and their trade-offs, since those decisions affect the who and when below. Ultimately, what are the tasks and activities we commit to deliver? So this is kind of the plan, right? So the plan here will be, in the planning game, the whole team discuss and do the plan. And in XP, by the way, if you look at Scrum and at XP, you don't have to use user stories or anything. It's just user stories were invented in XP as a way to express certain very important parts of the product, but also to allow you to think from the point of view of a user. And this is very important. So the technical solution, different approaches and their trade-offs, this is indeed one step that you do in planning, although not necessarily. This is something that you might decide later. You might let the team to decide in extreme programming. because you trust the team to make these decisions, and they will make these decisions, and you start from the goal and you figure out how long an increment you kind of need for that, and then you'll deal with this. Now obviously sometimes you have issues with the different alternatives, and then you need to discuss this, and one way that you use in XP to decide between the different viable approaches is to use a spike. A spike is a demonstration of one such approach, and that allows you to see what the trade-offs are between the different approaches. If you have a number of spikes, you can then compare those. Now, since XP appeared, we also have other techniques here that you can use. You can use architectural decision records that are very useful, and definitely, well, prototyping. I mean, spikes are a type of prototype. And spikes are interesting because they are a type of work that is limited in scope. So you say you would do a spike for 2 days related to this specific technical problem. And you need to have a limit, a duration limit for it, because otherwise research will just take forever. So you need to have a very clear goal, a very small goal, and use spikes to, well, in order to have spikes that are actually useful. Now here it starts to get a bit tricky. Describe the team members required to deliver the feature and their responsibility. This is where we assign the tasks outlined in the how. This is too detailed for me. I think at this point you either trust your team or not, and the team can make this decision. Whenever you go into these things, it gets a bit weird. You can, if you trust your team, they will feel that you trust them, and they can make these decisions, right? This is the important thing. Describe the delivery timeline. Is there a hard line? Can we estimate this work? How does this feature's priority affect delivery? What are internal and external blockers? This is where we align expectations and share commitment towards delivering the feature. Now, I think this is useful, and I like that he's asking, can we estimate this works? Because too often we want an estimation, and it's not always that simple, right? It can be a bit complicated to deal with this. So can we estimate? Maybe we cannot estimate, but at least we should be able to have a window, right? And say, okay, let's work for 1 week on this, or let's work for 3 days, or let's work for 2 weeks. And then if we are not done, then do some more work. But it's useful to use some limits. As for the other things here, I think these things can be solved. I mean, I find this as a good framework for conversations, but I think in XP you would have these conversations when you do the planning game, when you do customer tests, when you define the small releases, and so on. So one particular practice in XP is that the customer ideally is on site, right? If the customer is on site, then you can discuss with them. And today by on site you can mean accessible remotely, right? You can have conversations with customers. And so what's very interesting here is that it's basically a rediscovery of XP, most of it, rediscovery of extreme programming, starting from a very typical problem. And let's see what the problem is, because I found it interesting where he started from. So he says, why don't you Scrum to manage my remote teams? The short version, it adds at least 8 hours of meetings per sprint. That's 2 full days of lost productivity per team member per month. This is what I do instead. Now, before we move on, I think that I've heard this again and again as an issue, that you have too many meetings or too many hours of meetings in Scrum. Now, the problem is, if you're only looking at this, you're not looking at the value that those meetings bring. So if you have, and actually in Scrum, they are not thought of as meetings. They are events where you inspect and adapt. Remember that Scrum is about empirical process control, and the key here is to inspect and adapt. So you meet for the planning session because you need to inspect where you are with the product and adapt your plan to what you've learned. You meet daily because you inspect your progress and you adapt what you'll be doing today and in the next days. You meet for the review because you inspect the results of your sprint and you adapt for the next sprint. You meet by getting feedback from your product owner or whoever is there. You meet for the retrospective because you inspect the way you work and you adapt your way of working based on what you've learned since. So everything is about empirical process control. You can skip any of these events, and there are teams who do that once they become very proficient of doing the inspect and adapt as they go. And if you do the inspect and adapt as you go, it starts looking a lot like Kanban, because in Kanban you always inspect and adapt. Actually, it's the same idea. So seeing the 8 hours of meetings as a waste, because that's basically what he's saying, it means you're probably not using them as you should. Plus, why do you have 8 hours of meetings? I mean, if the things that are discussed are not that interesting, important, are not helping, then you need to inspect and adapt the way you organize, right? And then you adapt. Now, with this being said, in this case, he's saying that, he has experience with Scrum, so maybe this is what he learned through his experience with Scrum, and then he started to, by this inspect and adapt, he moved to a better suited process. I can definitely accept that. But you need to be very wary of focusing on the things like, oh, we have too many meetings in Scrum. Let's remove some of the meetings because they are just too many. And what is the value that you seek? How would you get that value better? This is what you need to ask. All right, earlier in my career, I used Scrum, at times because I was pushed, other times because I didn't know better. Everyone was doing it, so it felt like the natural way to manage tech projects to me. To me, as an engineer, it doesn't feel like the natural way. As an engineer, I feel closer to XP and Kanban. So yeah, these were the normal Scrum meetings in my team, and then so 8 hours. All right, just for process boilerplate. Well, this is what I was talking about. This is not necessarily process boilerplate. You should get value out of those events. If you don't get value out of those events, you need to retrospect, you need to inspect and adapt. And usually in the beginning, be wary of removing meetings. You can as an experiment, but typically what will happen is that you will lose something else. Those meetings got extended every sprint because those scheduled meetings overran. The proverbial let's take this one offline, which is another meeting. Even more proverbial, let's book a follow-up to close this off, another meeting. Okay, this sounds to me like there were other problems related to the way the team was working, and Scrum was making them see those problems, but they were kind of blind to those. I started seeing red flags in Scrum and I started implementing asynchronous processes in my teams. I heard people in different time zones and forcing them all to sit in so many meetings, starting feeling like a big bottleneck. Scrum isn't compatible with async, in my opinion. More or less. I mean, ideally you'd have the people in the same room. And yeah, with async, probably not. You need Scrum requires sync, right? Because it requires those events. But even if you replace Scrum with something else, you still need to think about how you make those synchronizations and that inspect and adapt. If you are losing on inspect and adapt, you are basically losing from future productivity. Since then, I've stopped using Scrum. It was my first step to reduce meetings. Beyond the time actually set the meetings, they are also a big distraction for people who need to do deep work. Okay, and then you can replace meetings with async processes. Sure. And some people prefer that. That's absolutely fine. No comment about this. Another thing I don't like in Scrum is how it forces all project features into a 2-week framework. Some features are small and take just a few days, others are enormous and take longer than 2 weeks. Not all types of effort fit well into such a fixed framework. Well, here's the interesting thing. Even if you're doing XP, you would look to work on the smallest things possible. So this to me is pointing to problems related to incremental thinking. Incremental thinking is a specific way of approaching problems where you take a big problem and then you split it into smaller problems. And then you ask for each problem, okay, would this fit in 1 week or in 3 days or in 4 days? It doesn't have to be an exact estimation, right? It has to be like, okay, 80% sure that it will fit in within 5 days. Fine. And coming from software, well, from a mindset of an engineer, even a software engineer, this is how I think about things. I have a big problem, let's split it into smaller problems. Which is the most important or the most difficult one to solve? Let's pick that one. Let's figure out, can we fit it into 1 week or 2 weeks? But I will still look to have very short cycles because very short cycles allow us to get feedback faster. But maybe he came up with other ways of figuring out how to get this feedback faster. Features that are longer than 2 weeks, I don't like those. I know you can have features, obviously, by the time they are ready for production, particularly when we are building a product from ground up. When you are in a startup, you are always building probably from scratch or as much as possible from scratch. And then you would have some issues with certain features to fit them into 2 weeks. So I think I would focus more on making them smaller, and you can actually make them smaller if you start thinking incrementally. Now, thinking incrementally is a big challenge, and it's hard to discuss in a short time frame. So if you want to learn more about it, let me know. For me, it makes more sense to develop software in a goal-oriented way. Goal meaning a clear business case that supports why such feature needs to be built. Example, we need HIPAA compliance to sell to clients in the healthcare sector. I agree. And this is where things like impact mapping are extremely useful. Impact mapping is a technique where you start from the business goal and then you map out the people who help and the people who want help. Actors, basically, not only people. Actors can be companies, can be other systems. And then for each actor, you define behavior changes that will help you. And then for each behavior change, you figure out how to implement those things. And this gives you a clear connection between a business goal and the possibilities that you have for achieving that goal. And you start implementing some of these ideas until you reach the goal. So you're not supposed to implement everything, but only those that actually get you to the goal. And of course, you don't know which ones will. You do a bit of guessing and you implement some of those, and then you measure and you figure out, okay, have we achieved the goal, yes or no? If no, we continue implementing things. If yes, then okay, we scratch that, was the next goal. Now, where I don't like is that we need HIPAA compliance to sell to clients in the healthcare sector. This can be a huge goal. I've been working with healthcare, and HIPAA is really, really difficult to achieve. Well, you can use some shortcuts, but it can be very difficult to achieve. So it is quite. This is a very big goal, and it makes sense for the business, but I would need to split it. If I were starting from this, I would split it into smaller things. Between idea and shipping, there are many activities such as create business case, collect requirements, assess feasibility and trade-offs, plan, architect the solution, implement, test, launch, retrospect on results. Okay, retrospect is a bit late if this takes longer than 2 weeks. So this is one reason why I will need, because the way you learn as an organization is if you have very short cycles. If you have very short cycles, that you can learn faster. And if you learn faster, that will translate into improvements. So basically, by having short cycles, you'll get faster results in the future. You're investing in that. And this is why I would still limit, the upper limit for features, you should have one. And okay, maybe in some cases it's more than 2 weeks. I know Basecamp has been doing this thing where they have 6 weeks for introducing new features in their product, but what they are doing is actually UX, UI, so a lot of UX, design thinking, a lot of things that are there. And so lots of prototypes that are incrementally improved until reaching the point where you can get to launch. So I break them into these 5 important questions. Why the clear business case? What the feature that will address the business case? How the technical approach to implement the solution? Who the team and resources needed for that effort? When the delivery timeline for expectation alignment? Now, I don't bring my whole team into a brainstorm meeting to address these questions. Each depends on different stakeholders, and they can be tackled sequentially for the most part. In my teams, all these 5 questions live in the same collaborative document, That's a good thing. Okay. Not bringing the whole team, also okay. I mean, even in Scrum, you don't have to bring the whole team for everything, and neither in XP, right? I have these 5 questions section of a Notion template, and this is what we saw as the picture. Usually the document is started by the business stakeholder or product manager. They define the why. E.g. of why we need to comply with regulations in the healthcare sector. From this why, a product manager usually crafts the what. It needs to be clear enough so that engineers understand it, but flexible enough to take input around feasibility and implementation trade-offs. The how, who, example of what? Our data needs to be stored in HIPAA compliant servers. Okay, that's easier to do. The how, who, and when are usually collaborative and led by technical stakeholders. Example, and I think that would be engineering manager. Resources or time constraints forced to cut scope. Trade-offs are to be discussed collaboratively. Example of how: move database and file system to HIPAA compliant AWS services. This is what I was thinking. This is the easiest way of dealing with this problem. The how discussion should clarify the task to be done and the assigned need for each of them. The who trade-offs regarding timeline should have been clarified and shared expectations about when should have been aligned. It ends with ownership and accountability to deliver. In my teams, we can do this without meetings for most tasks. For tasks with denser trade-off considerations, we jump on a meeting to discuss those live and commit on approach. Long iteration over async comms can create very long lead times, so I offer meeting of those. Good thing, right? So meetings can solve it. You see, you still need some synchronization, right? From time to time, no matter how asynchronous you want to be. This is how I shifted from a heavy meeting culture to an async first workflow. I can tell it was one of the key contributions to this acute before and after effect in my career. I'm more productive, my teams are more efficient, and none of us is burned out. All right. So this is interesting, and I think it's a good approach in general. I have a few concerns about this approach that would be interesting to discuss, and because whenever you change things from one of these established frameworks, you risk going into some issues. And here's one problem. What he's saying is that, where was this? The product manager defined the why. That's absolutely fine. The why should always be defined by a business stakeholder or product manager. They are the ones who have the information, the knowledge, the authority to make these decisions, right? They can say, okay, so our next goal should be X. This is absolutely correct. And it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're doing Scrum, if you're doing XP, if you're doing Kanban, or if you're doing this kind of async process, absolutely fine. From this why, a product manager usually crafts the what. Okay, so this is maybe where some collaboration happens behind the scenes. A product manager would have to discuss a bit with other people. Maybe UX, maybe developers in some points. So I imagine you still have a lot of collaboration behind the scenes. Even though, so it's not a meeting, or it might be a meeting if you need to sync, but it could be just on chat or something like that. How, who, and when are usually collaborative and led by technical stakeholders, for example, an engineering manager. Right. So starting here, what I fear is that you have some kind of split between developers. And I know this is a bit controversial for many people, right? I mean, one of the things in Scrum is that, and and in XP is that you have the whole team aligned for a business goal, right? And because of this, they should be able to collaborate. They should be able to take work from each other when needed. One of the key elements in Scrum, Kanban, well, in Kanban it's less important, at least when you start, but you end up there. But in Scrum and XP is that you don't see the team as individual people, you see the team as a team. And what this means is, let's say that today one of my colleagues is not feeling well, has a headache, and he or she can come and say, okay, so I have a headache today, I will have problems finishing this task that I took for me, that I pulled. By the way, you should pull items, not be pushed on you. And so I pulled this task yesterday, but I'm having a headache. I don't feel that great. I need help solving this. And in that moment, you should have somebody else. I mean, that would be a team where somebody else can come and, oh, I can help. Okay. And we do some pair programming or whatever we need to do in order to finish this task. And so you look at the team as a team. And one of the advantages of this is that you get this collective ownership. And it's not only collective code ownership, but it's collective ownership on everything. You can see that it's not written as collective code ownership. You own the goal, you own the way you work because you are defining it, and you own the result, right? When you do this sounds like you're doing separate streams. When you say, okay, we have these features and now we'll be working on these in parallel with whomever needs to work on this. And in that situation, the question is, how can you adapt to changes? How can you adapt to situations where somebody is not feeling that great, or maybe they leave the company, or they are having some problems, and how do you deal with external factors? How do you deal with, AWS issues if you're using AWS, and so on? When you have a whole team working, so you have a very clear goal, you have the whole team working towards that goal, you make that common collective ownership, and they collaborate towards that goal. If you can reach that point, which is quite hard to reach because you need to work with psychology, you need to work with group psychology and personal psychology and see, how to fit different personalities together and how to help them work together. But if you can do that, then you end up with a system that is self-improving and that is also very stable, that will not fail very often, right? And this is the key. So I'm afraid that I'm not sure, it's not clear from the details here, but it sounds to me like you are separating streams and you say, okay, these 3 people work on this task, these 2 people work on this, these 4 people work on this, these 5 work on this, and you work for 2 months, you work for 2 weeks, you work for 3 weeks, you work for 4 weeks. And then you keep changing this depending on how you have the projects. This is fundamentally a Kanban system, but I'm not sure that you take into account minimize waste. It might look like, you've attacked one type of waste, which is wasteful meetings, least wasteful from your point of view, but you don't necessarily attack the other types of waste. One of them being, for example, handoffs. So what happens if one of your developers need to work on a completely different area of code that they have no idea how to work on, because you've created these silos inside your teams and they haven't touched each other's code. And that is a handoff. And when you have handoffs, that is a type of waste, right? If you are analyzing it Kanban style, you would see this type of waste and improve it. All right, so we are getting close to the end, and I think this was quite interesting because this mirrors a lot of the things that I've seen related to Scrum. And I find it very interesting that the end result is very close to the organizational side of extreme programming. It ignores completely the technical side of extreme programming. But if I were to work in such a context, in a startup context, Kanban plus XP would solve these problems very, very neatly. And it doesn't have to, you don't have to do necessarily synchronized meetings. You can also work async. But it's good to have these useful events where you get together and you figure out how to solve problems collaboratively. And in return, you get collective ownership, which is really useful for the morale of your team and not only, for many other things. All right. What else can I say? We're getting close to the end, 2 more minutes. I haven't seen any questions, but if you have questions, if you are watching this later and not live and you still have questions, please leave us some comments. That would be very nice. If you want to learn more about Scrum, Kanban, extreme programming, different types of architectures, visit our website, mosaicworks.com, mosaic with a Z, mosaicworks.com, and you'll find there our offer. And thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being live with me. I love these events. This is a way for me to end the week in a nice way. So I think I will do more live sessions. But it's great to be with you. And if you like this, leave us a like, share the video. If you think it would be useful to other people from your circles, share with them. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, until next time, to think, design, and work smart.